What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Patch 5.18 is a really important patch because it's the patch that the Season 5 World Championship is going to be played on, and with it come a lot of hidden changes that you aren't going to notice by just reading the patch notes. There weren't too many nerfs, but there were lots of indirect buffs in this patch, and these kinds of changes are one of my most favorite things to talk about. Let's get started. The first group of champions that received an indirect buff is basically all of the Bruisers who weren't nerfed in this patch. This is because those Bruisers were never going to see play over the overpowered Juggernauts in the last patch, since they got so heavily outclassed by the Juggernaut kits being just so powerful. With the nerf to the kits of those Juggernauts, the Bruisers who failed to see play over the other more powerful options are going to be outclassed a bit less now. The Bruiser meta is more of a result of the item changes rather than any individual champions defining the meta, so now that they're toned down a bit, we'll start to see other Bruisers who may have previously been outclassed picked a bit more in some games. The next group of champions who received an indirect buff are Ginderhulk Junglers, with the exception of Skarner because he was directly nerfed in this patch. This is because of the nerf to the Devourer jungle enchant. Devourer is actually a really strong counter to Ginderhulk, since the attack speed it brings causes it to be a strong source of both sustained and mixed damage, which is the best way to kill any tank, and by lowering the power of Devourer junglers, Ginderhulk junglers receive an indirect buff. In addition, the nerfs to Elise actually helped tank junglers out quite a bit too, because she was a strong counterpick option with her percent max health damage to those Ginderhulk junglers. And also, attack damage top laners who tend to have damage focused builds received an indirect buff too. Not really like assassins, but more like the melee all-in brawler kind of champions. Think like maybe Aatrox or Riven, or maybe something like full damage Jarvan. AD champions who basically build full damage in the top lane, with the exception of Fiora of course, since she did receive a direct nerf on this patch. This buff occurs because the Juggernauts are huge counterpicks to those kinds of champions who fail to match up to the strength of Juggernauts since they are so squishy, but don't have the tankiness to survive the all-in combo that a Juggernaut might bring to a fight. And so, just like always, when the main counterpick of a champion gets nerfed, well, that's going to cause an indirect buff. And lastly, Graves received an indirect buff as well. This is a direct result from the buff to Ezreal, as well as the nerfs to Bruisers. Graves is a great counterpick to Ezreal, and although he's not the only champion that counters Ezreal, he brings a much more competitive skill set than some of the other champions like maybe Draven who counter Ezreal, but have a much harder time in this meta due to their own individual skill sets. So the indirect buff champions like Draven received is fairly insignificant. And with the nerfs to Bruisers, Graves also gets a leg up since they will have a harder time killing him in teamfights, and since the Ezreal buff is actually quite strong, it's possible that Graves will shine through as the premier counterpick. And that's going to be it. I really like this series a lot, so I'll try to be consistent with it whenever a reasonably sized patch comes out. Thanks for watching, everybody!
Symptomatic fecal flaws due to twisting gut afflictions, but to both in a time I know